reading from verse 24 to 29. And somehow I sense that my message this morning might only be an introduction. We are taught when we go to Bible college to train that your introduction should only be about 5 minutes. But for the first time, my introduction might be a message this morning. But Genesis chapter 32, reading verse 24 to 29. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with man, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask of my name? And he blessed him there. I want to focus this morning on an encounter with God. An encounter with God. Before we can look at this text, it's very important for us to have a background of what we're dealing with. Looking at the life of Jacob as he wrestled with God at Peniel. But if you were to start looking at this text without an understanding of what transpired before, we would not do justice to this text and we might miss the big picture. So my intention this morning is to focus on some of the things that come before, that when we come to look at the text, then we'll have a better understanding of what transpired here. And as I think of encounter, I believe that we all have encounters within our lives. There are different encounters we have. We have encounters with people from different walks of life. I'm quite sure over this week that you have had encounters. Some encounters are good, that you really relish. Some encounters you have with some people are bad. We have encounters with people at work. We have encounters within our home. We have encounters with friends. We have encounters with people who we like and people who we do not like, or people who like us and those who do not like us. I believe that everyone who has met with God at some stage within your life, you have had an encounter. In fact, in order for us to be saved, we must have an encounter with God. And we're going to be looking at the encounter that Jacob had with God. But before we can do that, we just need to establish who was Jacob. Who was this guy that has this unique encounter? The first thing we note here is that Jacob, he came from a family that were deep in hostilities. And when I was looking at this text, the thought comes to me that many times when we look at the people within the Bible, we normally see them as some super heroes or some people who are out of the realm of natural day experience. But I want to project Jacob as a normal human being, as a man who have had some of the difficulties that we are experiencing, who have had some of the challenges that we face on a daily basis. Jacob came from a family that were deep in hostilities. We have known that Jacob's that his family, he had two wives, Rachel and Leah. And we've noticed that there were jealousy between the two. Rachel was jealous of Leah because in those days, having kids was a form of blessing. And if a woman who is married could not have children, it was seen as a curse. And we've noticed that because Leah could have kids and Rachel couldn't have kids, Rachel was jealous of Leah. So Jacob came from a family where jealousy was very much prevalent. Not just that, but Jacob came from a family where his brother hated him. In Genesis chapter 27, verse 41 to 45, and I'm not going to look at that, I'm just highlighting some of these texts for you. The Esau hated Jacob. Hatred. Very, very strange for us to be looking at a historical, biblical character, a person who we look to for an example to say he's coming from a family where hatred was very much there. Not just that, but in the same verses, we have seen where Esau plotted to kill Jacob. In other words, Esau make a threat on Jacob's life. The moment that my dad die, I'm going to kill him. In this day and age, if we make that threat, we'll be arrested by the police. So Jacob is not coming from an ideal family, as we might say. He's coming from a family, hatred existed, the threat of death existed. But also, Jacob's mother, I've just mentioned that. In Genesis 30 verse 1, the whole idea that Rachel hated his, Jacob's other wife. But also in Genesis 31 verse 1, we have seen that Jacob's uncle, children, might be his cousins, they also hated Jacob. So it was a family that was really filled and mixed up with jealousy and hatred and the plot of death, etc. And I wonder today if we are living or come out of a family where all of these things exist, what would people think of us? How would we be viewed by people? Look at your mom. Look at your dad. Look at your children. Look at what is happening within your family. What I want to bring out this morning is that sometimes our perception of people and our perception of these Bible characters sometimes, if we were to dig down deep, we would see that they were normal men and women like you. And sometimes, even though we look upon them as examples, which we should, we can see that there are some things that emerge within their lives that probably we ourselves do not have. We ourselves do not do those things. And this might help us to have a better understanding of who we are in this life. So as I've said, before I can look at this text, I need to give you a backdrop, a background understanding of who Jacob was. What was some of Jacob's character? Jacob was a determined man. He was determined. He has a character of determination where he set out to achieve, which was very good. But the other thing about Jacob, he was ruthless. A ruthless young man. In Genesis 25, verse 29 to 34, we have seen where Jacob lured Esau into selling his birthright. Esau came from the bushes, came from from this plantation where he was hungry. Hungry. Jacob seek the opportunity. Jacob grasped that opportunity to get his birthright. This is my opportunity. A ruthless young man. Esau was at the verge of death. Jacob said, if you want some of my porridge, some of my soup to save your life, you have to trade with me your birthright. A young man that was ruthless. A young man that was not very much loving, as we must say, towards his brother. Can you imagine your brother coming very hungry and you have a big pot of soup? Your brother says, I'm dying for hunger. Can I have some soup? Can I have something to eat to save my life? And you jump on that. In order for you to do that, you have to pay with this. We would have given our brother easily. So here we see Jacob, not a very, very good character. He encouraged or he lured Esau to sell his birthright. Jacob, the word Jacob, it means deceiver. So Jacob was a deceiver. It also, the Greek word here, the Hebrew word here, said that he was a grabber. A man who was going to grab everything that he possibly can get. A deceiver and a grabber. In Genesis 30, verse 25 to 43, we have seen where Jacob deceived his uncle Laban and stole his cattle, stole his sheep. We don't have time to get into that. But Jacob, he made a deal with his uncle Laban and said, all the sheep that are spotted and speckled, they will be mine. And when we look into this, and I don't know if there was some genetic thing about it, etc. But Jacob was able to cut a tree and to put it in the water in front of the sheep, those that were pregnant, the best one. That as they come to drink and they look on that thing, that what they produce will be spotted and speckled, that he could get them. So in a short time, he amassed a great herd out of his uncle Laban. Jacob, he was a deceiver. He deceived his uncle Laban. And I said, I'm getting to this text, and I might not get there this morning. I just want you to see who we are dealing with. So when we come to this text, we will see, have a better understanding of what was happening here. He gained riches from deception. Gain riches from deception. Can you imagine in the church today we were to find somebody who was a prominent person, who was a deceiver, who was a grabber, a person who was ruthless, a person who was cunning, a person who tried to gain things at people's expense. Jacob was a man like that. The same craftiness that Jacob used upon his brother over 14 years ago, he was using it on his uncle Laban. What were some of his previous experiences? So we have seen Jacob, we have seen who he was, we have seen a bit about his character, about some of his previous experiences. Jacob had many struggles, difficult life. He wasn't a man who was sailing and having it easy. Jacob had many years of struggle. He struggled with his uncle Laban. He worked for his uncle Laban for 21 years. And during that time, for 14 years he worked with his uncle Laban for nothing. So in other words, his uncle Laban was abusing him, was using him for his gain. 14 years of labor for nothing. Hence, you can see one of the reasons why Jacob said, well, okay, I've worked with you for long. Now I'm going to try to get something out of you. So he struggled with Laban. Can you imagine going out to work every day for 14 years without being paid. Jacob also was tricked, according to Genesis 29, 15 to 26. We have seen where Jacob was tricked by his uncle Laban to marry Leah, the woman who he didn't love. Jacob made an agreement with his uncle Laban, which was his cousin, marrying his cousin, but those days those things were normal. And he said, well, I will work for you for 7 years, but at the end of the 7 years, I want you to give me Rachel to be my wife. And they signed the agreement. Jacob worked for 7 years, and at the end of the 7 years, Laban tricked him by giving him Leah instead of Rachel. And you might say, how is it that he could know? Within our culture, within those cultures, as you know, the women were covered. You couldn't see their face. So when he got his wife, he didn't realize that he was the wrong woman until wake up in the morning. But he was already married. So Jacob, not his family, not only Jacob has this trickery and this craftiness, but even his uncle Laban possessed the same thing. We're looking at a family that really have some mix-up things about them. In Genesis 31, verse 7, Jacob said Laban changed his wages 10 times. So they said, okay, the spotted will be yours, Jacob. And when the animal becomes being spotted, then Laban said, no, I will have the spotted one. You have the other ones. And when that started to grow, he said, no, I will have those. You will have the others. So he was very, very crafty and cunning in the way that he was treating Jacob. So there was conflict within the family. Not a family that you will look upon today and say that is a good example of people who we want to follow. Change his wages 10 times. How did Jacob's experience influence his behavior? Psychologists say a lot of times who we are is a product of our environment, a product of how we grow up, how we are taught and trained, who we are. Jacob was a con artist, a con man. And from base what I've said to you, he tricked his uncle Laban. We have seen where he stole the birthright from his brother, that caused his brother to hate him and want to kill him. We see that he was a con man. Some of the treachery of his uncle Laban rub off on him. Even though he left, he ran away from home because Esau wanted to kill him, run to another area to live with his uncle, to get away from his brother Esau. But there he was faced with the same trickery with his uncle Laban. And some of that trickery rub off on him. And it's seen that under Laban, Jacob perfected his craft. He learned more how to deceive. It is said that good behavior or bad behavior can be learned. We can learn from our experiences. I'm going to quietly say this. But in school, some of the kids that come to us, a typical example, so you might have a generation. So we have this kid that leaves school, it was a nightmare, and then the brother comes in and it's the same. And when you meet the parents at parents' evening, you can see a catalog, you can understand sometimes. And also in the reverse, some excellent kids, and when you meet the parents, you can see, I'm not saying that it happens in all cases, but sometimes you can see that the kids many times are a product of their environment, product of their family tree and background. Jacob seemed to have developed this craft because of who he was living amongst. He was a man with many struggles, difficulties, grafting, as some people might say, to make ends meet, grafting to succeed in life, facing many, many challenges. You might be going through similar challenges this morning. Why am I going through this? Why things can't be right? Jacob had those experiences. He had a difficult youth when he was growing up. He had to work very hard only to achieve what he achieved through craftiness and manipulation. And although that God promised Jacob that through him nations shall be born, yet we see in him a man who was full of fear and anxiety. Jacob was a man that was anxious. He was fearful. He filled with fear. He was an anxious man. But the time came when Jacob said, I need to return home. In Genesis chapter 30, verse 26, we later learned that God said, okay, Jacob, you need to go back home and you need to sort out some of the history that you had left behind you. Don't put it aside. You can't run away from it. You need to sort it out. You need to address it. And many times, in order for us to deal with or to move forward, we have to address some of the issues that were not addressed in the past. Years have passed. As with Jacob's case here, 21 years have passed where there was some unsettled business that God said to Jacob, it's time to go back and to resolve these things. So in order for us to break through the barriers in our lives, we many times need to revisit some unsettled issues within our lives. In order for us to overcome our struggles and make the proper strides within our lives, we need to correct some of the errors or some of the bad actions we have made in the past. Hard to move forward until those are corrected. And so God said to Jacob, you need to go back home. I want you to return home to address some of the issues. And I believe that Jacob have thought about this many times. Many a nights, I believe, that Jacob would sit back and he would reflect. Think of his mother back home. Think of his brother. Think of his parents back home and said, well, I cannot go back. Imagine you having your relatives back in the Caribbean or wherever, and you cannot go back. If I go back, my life is going to be in jeopardy. I was talking to one of my cousins who is in America over the holiday, probably just a few days ago. And he's living with one of his daughters in the States. And he said, I was held up 3 times in Jamaica, held up at gunpoint. And I was told, do not go back home, because if you do, the next time you could be killed. They said, you are one of the luckiest men we can think of. Very, very rare that people get held up at gunpoint 3 times and not being killed. So he was saying, I'm a bit scared to really go back home. Jacob was scared of going back home because there was a threat to his life. He came to terms with himself and realized that he has to correct some of the things that need correcting in the past. I'm going to stop here this morning, and next week I want to look at Jacob at this place. After 21 years away from home, God directed Jacob and told him that he needed to go back home. And hence, we have an overview of him, and then we'll be able to look at this text, which we'll do so next week. Shall we pray? Father in heaven, we give you thanks for your word today. We just pray the Lord, you will guide us and that you will help us. And Lord, we just pray that you help us to extract some of the truth that you have given to us this morning, and to realize, Lord, that we might be going through difficulties and struggles, but we have seen a typical example within Jacob, a man who was filled with anxiety, a man who faced some levels of depression, a man who was scared of his past, but a man who you want to go back and to address some of the issues with his past. We just pray the Lord, you will guide and direct us and lead us, Lord, as we worship you. In Jesus' name, amen.